This is Carola DeVille, and you're watching Inkwife TV. In today's episode, I'm going to tattoo a cat portrait. My hope with this tattoo is to create some really good looking fur texture. This cat had a Siamese look to it. It's a really fluffy looking Siamese cat. So normally when you're tattooing the mask of an animal, the colors in the front of the face are a lot lighter than the rest of the face. Usually it's lighter on the snout and around the mouth, but it's the opposite when you have a Siamese cat, and that created a completely different necessity of techniques. I don't know, I had never done a Siamese like this in a realistic manner before, and so I had to work kind of in a very different way with shading the mask than I normally would have. But we'll get to that later. To start this out and line it, I ran with an 11 round liner for all the thick lines around the outside, and then I went back in and did all the smaller detail lines with a 5 round liner. I didn't need to focus on that much because it's not the main focus of this tattoo. So with every time I'm trying to do some sort of animal texture, there's always a time of experiment kind of at the beginning of the tattoo. I'm not quite sure how all the colors are going to lay in to give the effect that I want, so I try to pick an obscure part of the tattoo and do my color experimentation over there. So if I use something that's a wrong tone, I can keep it in a very confined area and cover it up way more easily where nobody will ever notice that was my place to experiment. So keep that in mind, when you're sorting out which colors you're going to use. Find an obscure area and figure it out back there where it'll be more in the background. So the tail was a great place to start. And this cat had a white tip on the end of its tail, so that was fun to work with. Light hair, light fur. I've had a problem with going too dark before in the past on fur that's supposed to be very light. It can be really tricky because you want those shadows and those details, but you just can't go dark. So anyway, I'll explain a little bit of my process of what I've been doing. The first thing I did was I went in with a gray wash and just lightly put the shadows into the textures in the fur. Then after I had put those in the gray wash, I went back with like a dark burnt umber and worked the shadows in with that dark brown. I didn't apply any of the burnt umber to the tip of the tail at that point because I wanted to be very, very, very conservative with the shadows on the tip of the tail because I definitely wanted it to look white. I believe that the only shading colors that I used in the tip of the tail was a very pale almond, and I laid that almond on top of the gray wash shadow so it didn't look too heavy and too dark. I may have put a tiny bit of dark burnt umber just in a few explicit places on the tip so it had a little more definition and detail, but it still had a definite color differentiation from the rest of the tail, which was brown. I didn't show myself using the 5 round liner to outline the eyes, and I also outlined all of the individual whiskers. They look dark right now, but at the end of the tattoo, I want them to be white and to stand out from the background of the fur. So it's very important that you carefully, with a light gray wash, outline all of those whiskers if they're going to be pale. You can't just put that white on top of everything you've tattooed already. You have to leave a gap and a space for that white to go at the end. For the rest of the fur, I'm pretty much following the same pattern I did for the tail. First I laid in a gray wash and then went in with a dark burnt umber in the same shadows. Now you can see I'm using that almond color. That's the almond that I used in the shadows of the tail. So I'm using it for tonality in the dark brown, and I used it for shadow in the white part of the fur. You know, this reminds me of the very first cat I remember having, because that cat was also part Siamese, but he did not have those beautiful blue eyes that this cat that I'm tattooing has. But my first cat, who was a bit Siamese, his name was Ciati. And that's because C-A-T spells cat, and so I was being both logical and creative by naming the cat Ciati. The cat that I am working on today, his name was Lestat. And his human was getting this piece as a memorial to him because he has passed away. I asked her if I could talk about Lestat a little bit, and she said certainly, and she wrote me a little bit of information that I could share with you about him. She wrote, "When I first got Lestat, I was 9 years old. He was my best friend. He was there when I was bullied in school. He was there when I lost both my parents at a young age. He watched me graduate, get married, move across the U.S. twice, and then get divorced. He was my everything. He was 15 years old and he passed away from liver failure and jaundice. I found out suddenly when he got sick and went to several vets for them to tell me all the same thing. He does not have long to live. I had the option to put him through surgery, but I did not want to make Lestat miserable. He was already old and losing weight, so I decided to make him comfortable in his last weeks. I spent most of my time comforting him and letting him know how much I loved him. When it came time to put him down, my heart shattered and I held him, bawling my eyes out. I loved him with my whole heart, as I have never had a bond with an animal like that. He was my forever best friend. Lestat being tattooed on me was everything I wanted to pay tribute to him." You know, for all known human history, we've had a very close relationship with our animal friends, particularly cats and dogs. Almost all ancient cultures revered cats, worshipped them, mummified them, turned them into art. And so, what are we doing now as humans? We're just continuing to do the same thing. We're immortalizing our animal friends for as long as we can and taking them with us when we turn them into a memorial tattoo like this. But I have digressed for far too long, and I better get back to my process. I went over the face with the gray wash, same as I did with the rest of the fur. And then I used my burnt umber. And now I'm going in with some highlights with the almond. All the fur under his chin, around his chest, was that creamy white. So I wanted to keep it much lighter and have a very stark contrast between the fur on his chest and the fur on his face. Now this was a fun thing that I used with this tattoo. I used a very dark, not a bright purple at all. It's a very flat purple. I cannot remember the actual name of the color. But I used that purple in with the shadows on his mask, and I was really pleased with the results of this. It gave, blue. I like to pick up some reflective colors, like what you might see with, if you were outside and you had a little sunlight reflected off of him. Blue would be too harsh, but I thought purple with those browns would be a really nice shadow, with just a contrasting shadow color. I'm so sorry that my head is getting in the way for this. I wanted to show some of the coloring on the eyes, and my big red head just kept getting in the way. I really need to just do a ponytail more often, don't I? And that would solve a lot of my problems. This guy's eyes were just a beautiful, clear, glassy blue. So that's what I led with. I went with my robin's egg blue and then cross-dipped between my blue and white to create the little highlights under his eyes. And then for just a little bit more depth, I used my gray wash in the top of his eyes to create some shadow, added a few white highlights. And I love his eyes. They're so pretty and bright. At the very end, I went in with my white, my 15 curved mag, and created highlights in the creamy white fur. And also some more reflective highlights on the mask of his face too. He had some white around his eyes, just a little bit. The picture that I was working with for this tattoo was a little bit dim and a little bit hazy, so I did not have the super pristine clarity and detail that I would have liked to have had for this tattoo. So my goal was to go as realistic as I can, but just downgrade the crispness a little bit. It's not cartoony, it's not fake looking, it's realistic, it's just not incredibly realistic. Basically what I'm saying is I did the absolute best I could with the quality of photo that I had, and I was content that it was good enough to create a good looking tattoo. If it had been really bad quality, I would have just turned the project down, but I looked at it and was like, yes, this is a little fuzzy and a little dark, but with a little work on Procreate, we should be able to come up with something that is clear enough to work with and make a really good representation of this cat. As you saw, I put white into those whiskers, as I said I would. We are going to color the flowers and the leaves at a later date. We were running out of time for this first session, but we did want a little bit of background behind the cat fur, and I love the addition of this pink into it. It is just so sweet. In about a month or two, I will be doing a part 2 to this video. We're going to go in and add some color to the flowers and the leaves in the background, and at that point in time I will be able to touch up any highlights or go into any shadows that need to be darker. Anyway, I always think a tattoo is best when you can put a second session into it to touch up all of the details. But Lestat turned out beautiful today. He's got some blood showing through in his eyes, but I will show a healed up picture when I do session 2. Thank you guys for watching.